see where, what is this? I saw this one right here, and I have to watch this. Why FedEx bet their entire company in a casino. I have to know what the fuck this is about. Let's watch this shit. Let's see what FedEx did.
FedEx employs well over 500,000 people worldwide, has a market cap of over $40 billion, and delivers millions of packages every day in countries all over the world. But in the early 1970s, this future shipping empire depended on one man, $5,000, and a weekend in Las Vegas.
Wait,
This
what?
is the absolute
Whoa, bro. No. I was thinking they were going to be like, yeah, FedEx bought a casino. FedEx, invested in a casino. FedEx did something along the lines of that with a casino. Not FedEx gave this motherfucking dude $5,000 and said, have fun. If it works out, we lit. If it don't, this is it. Like, what?
crazy story of FedEx.
Bruh.
Frederick Wallace Smith, founder of FedEx, did not get off to a good start in life. At the age of 4, his father passed away, and for the first 10 years of his life, Fred was afflicted with a type of childhood arthritis called Perthes disease that affected his hips, temporarily causing a loss of blood flow and affecting his ability to walk. Thus, Fred was forced to spend his early years in leg braces and use crutches to get around. And Fred faced bullying as a child because of his condition. However, by his 10th birthday, Fred had overcome this, and he was able to not only walk, but within a few years began to acquire a love for flying, something that would play a pivotal role in his future success. But during high school, Fred started his first small business, the Arden Record Company, which he founded along with some friends. It started as a small recording studio in a garage, but eventually grew into a larger recording company which actually still operates to this day. However, Fred left the company in 1962 to go to Yale University and study economics. In his junior year, Fred wrote a term paper where he proposed a business idea that he said could revolutionize the way goods were transported. Now, at the time, packages were shipped throughout the US in the cargo holds of commercial airliners, and thus the delivery schedules were at the mercy of the passenger airlines. This meant package delivery times were much slower and less predictable. So, for people who had something to send urgently, for example, medical supplies or legal documents, surely there had to be a better and faster way. So, Fred's idea was to buy a fleet of jets, fly in the middle of the night whilst airports weren't as busy with outgoing flights, and then sort the packages at one central hub, and deliver the packages from there by truck. Fred believed this idea of carrying small, high-priority packages at night would mean that companies and individuals could have their packages delivered in just 1 or 2 days, much faster than the current restrictive airline schedule. Fred was excited about his idea and handed in his college.
That's smart, but bruh, let's go buy 5 jets. Let's just go spend, $1 billion on jets real quick. Like, what kind of shit? Come on, bro. Let's be fucking real.
However, he ended up only getting a C grade from his economics professor, who told him that the idea wasn't feasible and wouldn't work. Fred was obviously very deflated by this, but he was still convinced the idea had potential and wanted to pursue it and prove his professor wrong. However, after graduating from Yale in 1966, he would not get a chance to act on it. The Vietnam War was becoming more intense, and Fred's flying experience led him to 3 years in the US Marine Corps, including 2 tours in Vietnam as a navigator. His life was undoubtedly in danger during this period, and on one occasion, he even survived a Viet Cong ambush. However, during Fred's time in the military, 2 crucial things happened. Firstly, he paid close attention to how the military handled both sending and receiving goods, and noticed many ways their shipping logistics could be improved. There were often times where supplies took too long to get from one place to another. And secondly, in his spare moments in the barracks, Fred would always play blackjack, and he very quickly got a reputation for being really good at it. Of course, at the time, Fred was just playing for fun, a brief distraction from the horrors of war. But little did Fred know that this card game would completely change his life and the entire future of shipping.
So this motherfucker went and took 5 bins to the casino and said, all right, fuck it. If I come out this bitch rich, FedEx is a go. If I lose it, fuck it. I guess I'm in the same position I was in. You know what I'm saying? Like, it is what it is. Like, all right, fuck it.
After leaving the Marines in 1970 and witnessing the destruction of war, Fred said he was so sick of destroying and blowing things up and that he came back determined to do something more constructive. So once again thrusting himself into the unknown, at age 26, Fred began working at his father-in-law's business called Arkansas Aviation Sales, and soon bought a controlling interest in the company. The business was originally an aviation servicing and repair company, but Fred helped transform it into more of an aircraft dealership, which significantly increased company profits. But Fred was frustrated with how slowly things moved. Shipping parts from one point to another took too long, and the company was regularly struggling to get the parts they needed on time. Fred was once again reminded of his idea from his economics paper that would enable shipments to be delivered across the country within just 24 hours, as they wouldn't be reliant on passenger planes that happened to be flying to the destination the package was going. So Fred began planning out a system using both air and ground transportation that would be more efficient and involve non-passenger planes taking the packages to a central sorting facility where they then be sent off on their own separate routes and delivered by trucks. It was a hub and spoke system that he felt could truly revolutionize
so
shipping.
crazy how that
but
shit
he
actually
concluded
worked.
he needed 14 jets to begin his full operation. Now, Fred's family were wealthy, as his father had been a successful businessman who'd run several different enterprises, including a restaurant chain called Toddle House. And thus, before Fred's dad had passed away, he'd set up a trust fund for Fred. However, despite this, Fred still had nowhere near enough money for the size of the operation he was planning. So, Fred began pitching it to investors, and they were impressed with Fred's knowledge of the airline industry. It was clear Fred had put a lot of thought into this system, and investors knew what a lucrative business this could be if he pulled it off. So, by 1972, Fred managed to get around $91 million in loans and venture capital funding to build his revolutionary shipping business. Now, Fred's initial plan was actually to focus on checks to start with. Of course, now
$91 million in investment, bro. You know how hard it is to get investment? You know how good you have to be to just pitch an idea to somebody and get people to believe in you? I'm sure every one of y'all has had an idea. But have you yet to have somebody hear your idea and be like, dog, that's it. Where do you want me to send my money? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's different. Like, that's a whole, bruh. 91 million motherfucking dollars, nigga.
We take for granted money being
That's in the
instantly
90s,
transferred
nigga.
all over the world. But back in the
Fucking
days when people sent
1970s
checks
or
as
some
payments,
shit,
it was often a very
72.
long process.
Fuck
And
you
so
saying?
Fred contacted the Federal
$1
Reserve,
billion+
America's
now.
central banking system, hoping they could strike up a partnership. At the time, checks would often have a 10-day turnaround time, whereas with Fred's new shipping system, it could be a 24-hour process, allowing them to quickly deliver checks between the Federal Reserve banks. The Fed seemed to like the idea as well and agreed to the deal. So Fred went ahead and bought and outfitted a small fleet of lightweight aircraft to fulfill the contract. Landing the Fed as a client also inspired Fred's choice of business name, as he originally called the company Federal Express. Thus, Fred's shipping business was finally born, and the Federal Express logo was proudly plastered on each plane, letterhead, business card, and bulletin board. Fred had his first client, and a very big client at that, and so the future looked exciting. And then, quite suddenly, the Federal Reserve backed out of the deal, meaning Fred was stuck with the planes, bills, and the name Federal Express, despite no longer working with the Fed. This was a massive setback. But Fred kept the name Federal Express anyway. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1994 that he changed the company name to FedEx Corporation instead, because most people simply referred to the company by the shortened nickname FedEx anyway. But anyway, back in the early 70s, since he was no longer going to be transporting checks for the Federal Reserve, Fred turned his attention to shipping small, urgent packages for businesses and consumers.
I appreciate you,
and
bro.
on April 17th, 1973, FedEx officially began operating. Fred chose to base the company in Memphis, since it was fairly centrally located in the US, which made it an ideal hub for Fred's plan. Plus, Memphis Airport agreed to make certain adjustments they needed for the business to operate smoothly, and had additional hangar space readily available. Plus, the airport was rarely closed because of bad weather. So, FedEx was in business. And on the first night of operating, 14 aircraft delivered 186 packages to 25 different US cities. And word of this overnight delivery system quickly spread. The vision Fred had had back when he wrote the economics paper all those years ago was finally now a reality. But little did Fred know, a crisis was about to begin that would completely destroy the business.
Oh, shit.
Just as Fred's business was beginning, so was the 1973 oil crisis. You see, because of political tensions in the Middle East, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, placed an oil embargo on countries they believed were supporting Israel, which included the United States, where Fred was operating his business. Since the US heavily relied on oil from the Middle East, they were one of the hardest hit countries, and the oil prices quadrupled, and these rapidly rising fuel costs put FedEx in serious trouble. Federal Express was just getting off the ground, and the 14 Falcon airplanes airlines took a lot of jet fuel, and because of the oil embargo, jet fuel was hitting historic high prices with no potential downturn in sight. As a result, FedEx's operating costs were spiraling out of control, and the company was losing an estimated $30,000 per day. Fred's vision was literally...
Holy... fuck. You know how hard that is? $30,000 a day?
running out of gas, and Federal's Express hopeful beginnings were losing altitude. It's estimated in the first 26 months of business, Fred Smith saw a $29 million loss. And understandably, investors were not so keen on putting more money in, since it was unclear when oil prices would drop again. Fred became so desperate that he had to ask his loyal employees to hold on to their paychecks and not cash them for as long as possible, in order to try and keep the company afloat. FedEx pilots and drivers even started using their own credit cards to fuel up and get reimbursed later, as they knew how little money the company had left. Fred himself completely stopped taking any pay from the company because there wasn't really any to take. But it still wasn't enough. The oil embargo and difficult economic situation was all too much. The company got down to its last $5,000 in its bank account, and at that moment, Fred received a fuel bill for $24,000. It was a Friday, and with $5,000 in the business bank account and a bill of $24,000 due by Monday, it seemed Federal Express was heading for bankruptcy. In a desperate last-ditch attempt to save the business, Fred Smith tried to land a potential investment deal with General Dynamics, which could secure an emergency cash influx. He put his best suit on and went into the meeting believing this could be the turning point for his company. But the deal fell through. Due to the volatility of the current situation and the need to be conservative, General Dynamics rejected his pitch. After this denial for further business financing, it seemed Fred could not afford to pay the fuel bill, and therefore this was the end of his business. Sitting in an airport lounge on his way home from that meeting, Fred, feeling utterly depressed, began to think about the future of his then 389 employees and how they were all going to lose their jobs. He thought about his dream, how close they were, but how ultimately his economics professor was going to be proved right all along. As he sat in that airport lounge in Chicago, he knew that once he landed back in Memphis, he'd have to break the bad news to his team. He'd have to admit defeat and perhaps pack up the things in his office. After all, unless he could pay the fuel bill, the planes wouldn't fly Monday. For a moment, Fred felt completely defeated. It was over. But then he started to give himself a pep talk. This was Fred Smith, who'd beat a childhood of physical pain and overcome his disease. This was Fred Smith, who'd got his pilot's license at age 15 and helped start a record company in a garage whilst in high school. This was Fred Smith, who'd graduated from Yale and survived 2 tours in Vietnam. In that moment, Fred vowed that if the banks and investors wouldn't give him the money he needed to save the business, he'd get it himself. Fred was due to start boarding his flight in a few minutes, but at the last moment, he decided he wasn't going back to Memphis. Instead, Fred withdrew the final $5,000 in his company's bank account and impulsively booked a new flight to a different destination. Fred Smith was heading to Las Vegas.
He took that
Fred had decided if we're gonna go down, we're gonna go down with a fight. That's why he'd taken the company's last $5,000 and decided he was gonna gamble it and try to win enough money to pay FedEx's bills. So the survival of FedEx came down to a weekend of gambling in Las Vegas. Once Fred landed in Vegas, he headed straight to the blackjack tables. Now, blackjack is a pretty simple game. Your cards need to add up to a higher number than the dealer, but not go over 21. However, in the 70s, there were some blackjack tables which just used one deck of cards, which meant it was easier to count cards and gain an edge, a skill Fred had developed in the Marines from all the time he spent playing the game. Of course, whilst this gave him a slight advantage, it was still a game reliant on luck. And Fred's luck definitely went both up and down. He'd win a couple of hands, but then lose a couple, and so his winnings went up and down as well. It was nerve-wracking enough playing when there was just money on the line, but this was his entire company on the line, his dream, and the jobs of all his employees. But Fred remained focused, playing hand after hand, and at one point, managed to get up to $35,000.
What up, Kenny?
He felt unstoppable, but then he had a bad hand, and another. His confidence started to shake. His earnings were quickly falling, but luckily, he stopped with just enough. By the end of the weekend, Fred had successfully turned Federal Express's remaining balance of $5,000 into $27,000, and that was enough to pay the looming fuel bill and keep the company in the air for another week. So Fred quit while he was ahead, deposited the cash in the business bank account, and headed home. Now obviously, $20,000 wasn't going to be enough to save the company long term, but it bought himself and the company a little more time to come up with a plan. Before we get to the next chapter, I want to tell you about today's video sponsor, Masterworks.
Shout out to the sponsor, but we got to get back to this story. This is wild. This is fucking nuts.
When Fred returned, his team at FedEx was shocked to learn that Fred had taken the company's final $5,000 and literally gambled it. But to be fair to Fred, there had been logic to his decision. Without paying their fuel bill, the company was doomed to fail, so he essentially felt he had nothing to lose. And as it happened, the gamble quite literally paid off. It not only showed Fred was willing to risk it all for the business, but it had bought Fred more time to speak with investors. And sure enough, within a couple of weeks, Fred had managed to get new investors to come on board and put in $11 million. This resulted in their first profitable year in 1976. Now, during the turbulent 70s, most airlines and couriers were playing it very conservative and cut their costs as much as possible. But Fred, ever the gambler, decided that whilst their competition were being risk-averse, it was the perfect time for FedEx to double down on their marketing and go all in. So FedEx far outspent the competition with big advertising campaigns. This significantly increased FedEx's market share in the industry and improved the brand identity and recognition. However, they weren't even attempting to take business from the big guys. They were going after new territories and new markets. Federal Express initially kept its focus on smaller cities rather than the large ones where airline cargo holds were still delivering packages. This meant FedEx had much less competition and reached a lot of new customers. By 1976, 19,000 parcels per day were being moved, and due to their ability to handle big shipments so quickly, they soon attracted big customers like IBM and even the US Air Force. Federal Express was expanding quickly, but very soon there was another roadblock that Fred Smith and his team would have to deal with: the government. Hey guys, before we get to the next part of the story, I just want to say that if you find these videos
they come back, they double backed and was like, fuck, you want involved now?
I'm working on some even bigger projects right now.
Come on, move on.
A massive thank you for watching this channel. These videos do...
We're trying to get to the story, bro. It's a bad time. You could have waited fucking 5 more minutes.
During the later half of the 1970s, logistic companies of all shapes and sizes were beginning to pop up. Trucking was changing, shipyards were growing, and the transportation of packages by air was on the rise. But something was stifling progress: airline transport regulation. Because of previous regulations secured by the major airlines, they developed a monopoly on moving larger, weightier goods in their cargo holds. They got paid to move people, and they got paid to move packages, and they could move a lot because the regulation laws gave them precedence. And unlike companies such as FedEx, the airlines didn't have the same weight restrictions on their planes. For example, FedEx couldn't legally carry more than 7,500 pounds per plane, which restricted them to only small aircraft, which obviously hindered how much they could expand their business. But if that restriction were to be lifted, the sky was the limit, and Fred could use the largest planes possible to grow his business faster and expand his customer reach. So Fred decided to make another bold move, and joined forces with his competitors. FedEx and other small carriers banded together and vigorously lobbied the US government and the then president, Jimmy Carter. FedEx spent several years lobbying Congress for deregulation of air cargo, and this shared desire for true and fair competition paid off. In 1978, President Carter created and signed the Airline Deregulation Act, which removed the restrictive limits in place for couriers, such as the restriction about how much weight could be on board a plane. This gave FedEx and many other similar carriers the ability to fly as large of planes as they could afford, and thus provide genuine competition for the big commercial airlines. Fred Smith was now free to expand and grow at an almost limitless level. With this newfound freedom given by the federal government, Fred decided to take the company public on the stock market. And in 1978, FedEx had its IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, helping Fred raise even more money for the company. This influx of more money allowed Fred to expand the company's destination list, which meant building new hubs all over the United States, along with buying more and bigger planes. Fred finally had the freedom, the funding, and the drive to take his company to a whole new level. With more freedom and more planes, the 1980s saw even more rapid expansion for FedEx. In 1981, FedEx opened its first world hub in Memphis and built the company up to being the largest air freight company in the US at that time. Fred also expanded the company's technology as well, and it's reported FedEx were the first US company to use computers to internally manage and track packages. And by 1983, the financial security of FedEx was no longer in question. Sales topped $1 billion for the first time. And by 1984, they started intercontinental operations with shipping services to Europe.
So theoretically, this is kind of like where Amazon kind of they took a blueprint off of FedEx and just kind of like amplified that shit times 100.
Year after
Got
year
it.
during the 80s, FedEx stacked up new
Got
record-breaking
it.
stats. And by the end of the decade, they were operating in 90 countries across all continents. They also bought international couriers such as Geico Express International and Flying Tiger to help give them a stronger foothold in other countries too. Another big development FedEx pioneered in the 90s was allowing passengers to track their parcels themselves online via the internet. And by the end of the 90s, FedEx was the #1 overnight shipping service in the world. However, since FedEx's business model was clearly successful, more and more competition had also popped up.
Yep.
So, FedEx
Amazon.
began buying other companies to expand their offerings further. For example, in 2004, FedEx purchased the printing business Kinko's for $2.4 billion. They also acquired logistics companies, customs and duties companies, and many more businesses. This allowed FedEx to vertically integrate and be a part of the full package sending experience. And if you look at FedEx's services today, you'll see it's so much more than just the simple service of shipping packages from point A to point B, like when the company first began. As of today, FedEx's number of planes, hubs, and destinations have grown to staggering numbers, whilst Fred himself has become a multi-billionaire, as he's still the largest individual shareholder of FedEx. And since it's reported FedEx has over 700 planes in its fleet, it's actually one of the world's largest airlines. Not bad for a business idea that only got given a C grade. However, if you want to see an even crazier underdog business success story, you're definitely going to want to watch the story of Nike. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Just click the thumbnail here, and I'll see you there in a second.
Shit, bro. That shit's crazy, bro. It's actually not bad. That's a really cool. I like this little channel, bro. This is a cool little channel, bro. I ain't gonna lie. We're gonna keep this little channel in the rotation. We won't watch another one now, but we're gonna keep this channel in the rotation.